So imagine you're walking in the forest. Now, the first thing to say about that is you know what a forest is, because at some stage you will have learnt to recognize that this particular form, this appearance or manifestation of something that looks like a large expanse of land dominated by trees is called a forest. And that's useful because if you tell me that you've been walking in the forest, then I understand what you mean. It won't be necessary for me to be familiar with the same forest as you, but as long as the forest I have experienced or seen has a general resemblance to the description that I also learnt to give a name to, as you did, this name and form, then we can communicate these ideas. All of the objects we interact with, whether they're physical objects or whether they're abstract ideas and concepts, we give names to. This is name and form. And the fact that we can communicate means that this notion of self, the recognizable patterns of behavior that is manifested by personal selves, can also be communicated. Ideas can be exchanged about what these selves do, including our own self. But let's get back to the forest. You're walking in the forest and I call you on Zoom, and I say, okay, you're walking in the forest. Can you show me the forest? And you say, yes, sure. So you switch your camera on and you point your camera at a tree. You say, look, this is a magnificent example of this forest. Look at this majestic, ancient oak tree. It must be 300 years old. This is a great example of the forest. And I say, okay, that's fine, but what about that tree I can see in the background? It's a very young tree. I'm not sure it's even an oak tree. Is that also part of the forest? And you'll say, yes, that's also the forest. In fact, everything I show you as I'm walking is the forest. It's all part of the forest. These are all different aspects or appearances of what we can generally call forest. And if I ask you to show me the forest in its entirety, look, I just want to see the forest, you won't be able to do that. You'll only be able to show me these snapshots or glimpses of parts of the forest, all of which is described as and is known as forest. Even if you rise above the canopies and you look down at the entire forest, I'll still be able to pick out one part of it and say, is this forest? Rather than this bit over here, is that forest also? So when it comes to what manifests as personal self, the same applies. There is no single thought or idea or feeling or perception that we can say is self. What is self? It's only whatever is appearing to you at that moment, or it's whatever thought is, or stream of thoughts that you are experiencing. This is self. This manifestation of self is only that snapshot of what is happening from moment to moment. So this principle, which is expounded very clearly in Buddhism, this principle of Anatta, which is not self. Notice it is not no self, it is not self, because not self is really the answer to a question. Is anywhere that I look self? In the same way that when you were in the forest, if I asked you if that tree was the forest in its entirety as an entity, you would have to say no, that tree is not forest. It is forest, it is an expression of forest at that moment, but it is not forest. So the same applies to self. If I ask, is that particular thought or feeling you're experiencing right now, is that self? The answer would have to be no, it is not self. Because nowhere you look at any particular moment is an entity, a separate entity called self. There is an expression of self happening at that moment which changes to a different expression of self a moment later. So that's what not self means. It means that nowhere you look will you find a complete entity that is self. So any aspect of self, if you ask, is that self? The answer would have to be not self. And that is what the principle of Anatta, not self, means. Now, it would be ridiculous to say there is no self. These discussions often come up in non-duality. People say there is no self, but what is it that's expressing? It's selfing. Selfing is happening. We can't deny that there is no manifestation of self. But what we can say is there is nothing that is an entity called self. So it's not self, rather than no self. Now, why is this useful? It's useful because if we can appreciate that there is no such thing as a separate entity called self, that we are only ever experiencing snapshots or expressions in time which are continually changing. If we cannot find something that is complete, whole and unchanging, then it forces us to look elsewhere. It forces us to transcend that changing phenomenology of this limited personality, ego, self, and look for something which is unchanging. And again, time and time again, we're always going back to the same place, which is to go back to that stillness, that unchanging awareness that is unaffected and untainted by the superimposition of that which is changing as phenomena. So once we appreciate that, we're done with that discussion. There is no need to continually discuss notions about self and not self. You find this in these non-dual discussions, people talking about self, there's no separate self. Okay, when you're done with it, you're done with it. Now investigate what it is that is prior to that which is unchanging. Once you have appreciated what not self means, then you can put it to one side and focus your attention on that which is real.